Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and oftentimes whenever we think about the medieval period, we imagine the kings, we think about the knights and princes and this and the castle, but it's the common people and their day-to-day activities that really are a great representation of what it meant to live in the Middle Ages for the average medieval person. And of course, since we're talking about a feudal system, peasants are a great representation of that. So today, we will talk about what it meant to live as a peasant. What was the life of a medieval peasant like? The figure of the peasant during the early Middle Ages began to take shape already in the late Roman era, with the birth of the practice of colonatus, an exponential growth in the maintenance cost of the military and bureaucratic structure, together with an ever-decreasing influx of slaves caused by exponential decrease in conquest campaigns, had already put the late Roman imperial economy in crisis during the 3rd century AD. Along with these factors, barbarian incursions and slave revolts had produced a depopulation and impoverishment of the countryside, bringing the empire dangerously close to economic collapse. To remedy the production crisis, which evidently, especially in agriculture, could no longer be based on slave labor, landowners found themselves reforming rural work, which began to rely more and more on labor provided by free men, the so-called coloni. The landowner would enter into a contract with the colony, allowing them to keep a portion of the agricultural production of the estate for their own subsistence and that of their family, in exchange for the rest of the cultivated products and various services, which in the future would be defined as corvée. Now, at this time, to prevent the scarcity of labor, to put all of these coloni, which we just described as being these employed farmers, to start competing with each other, or maybe even try to find and work with the best offer, the authorities created a law that dictated that once the coloni had entered into a contract, they would be bound to the land and could no longer withdraw and abandon the estate. Now, clearly, being a slave is always a worsened situation societally, but it is important to look at this from the perspective of the fact that even though they were legally free men, freedom? Not 100%. Well, technically, I would imagine that we could say that they did have the freedom to decide to enter into a contract with this specific landowner, but the thing is that by law, once they did enter into that contract, then they did not have the freedom to leave it or break it. So it's a bit more nuanced. With the definitive collapse of the Roman world, society took several steps backwards, and many figures, particularly those related to commerce, tended to disappear or become liminal, while the simple tripartition that had already formed in the Bronze Age emerged. It would be Bishop Adalberon of Laon who, in the 11th century AD, in his Carmen ad Robertum Regem, explicitly cited the three orders into which feudal society was organized: the oratores, those who pray, so the priests; the bellatores, those who fight, belonging to the nobility; and the laboratores, those who work. Welcome to medieval feudal society. The importance of the peasant class is recognized in Adalberon's Carmen itself, which in fact states that, open quotes, wealth and clothing are provided to all by the work of peasants, and no free man could live without them. The tripartite society, according to Adalberon, should be understood as a system of interdependence among the three groups. The bellatores, those who fight, defend the oratores, those who pray, and the laboratores, those who work. The oratores pray for the soul of the bellatores and the laboratores finally maintain the other two groups with their work. Okay, so you're a medieval peasant. In addition to the corvée labor, so you've got to work the land to produce the harvest, then you need to give up part of that harvest so that you can give it to the Lord. You could be called to occasionally serve in the Lord's troops as conscripted militia. There was also one more thing. Taxes, my friend. Yes, peasants also had to pay taxes. Of course, these would vary from place to place and from context to context. If peasants managed to cultivate and preserve more products than strictly necessary for their own subsistence, they might want to sell them, but to display their goods on market days, they had to pay the lord the tax called plateaticum tax. If, as a result of trade or barter, peasants came to own animals, they necessarily had to mow and collect grass to feed and care for them. Then, of course, take them to pasture in the case of cattle and sheep, goats, or produce acorns in the case of pigs. In these specific cases, they had to pay the lord the tributes known as ius pascendi. herbaticum and glandaticum. And that's just a few very basic taxes. This is just the core of the taxes. Work, 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 tax, 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 work a little more, a little extra tax. You got an animal, more taxes. You need to buy the taxes. Hey, how about in the meantime, you go fight for me against the... Yeah, welcome to the Middle Ages. Alright, but what if you were like a really smart peasant? You know, you can do something that you always do in video games, Legend of Zelda. What you could do is, instead of like, you know, just harvesting, because then you need to pay the taxes and then the animals, how about you just go fishing? You find a little nice lake and then you fish, you get some fish and then you sell it. Or maybe you finish. Tax piscaticum, my friend. If, as a medieval peasant, in the land where you're working, there is a nice lake, or there are some rivers, and you fish, you're gonna pay taxes to the Lord. Okay, but what if, hear me out, this is a great plan. What if you just like grab a snail or two? You make a lot of snail, you Pantanaticum tax, my friend. I thought of everything. Why am I laughing? This is horrible. The Pantanaticum tax was used if someone collected snails or frogs in stagnant waters that were the property of the Lord. Well, you know, at least we have got to say that peasants did eat well when, you know, unless the crops failed or there was a war or there was a famine. But I'm just saying, in a regular situation, at least peasants could eat well. And even more so during religious holidays. Because, of course, fishing and catching small animals was an element in enriching the medieval peasants' diet. But that diet already was pretty good and consisted of cereal, seasonal vegetables, bread, often consumed together in a form of soup, sometimes accompanied by a little cheese. And as we say, during religious holidays, they may, if they were successful, eat some meat from cattle, pigs, sheep or goat. Although then again, eating meat, I mean, you have to be a successful one, because otherwise it's mostly for the upper class. But since we mentioned holidays, I've got a few things to say about that. Holidays occupied a very important position in the life of a medieval person, and in some ways even more so for peasants, considering that no work was done on feast days. While the standard of living and quality of work for the medieval peasant were certainly much worse compared to those of contemporary people, from a perspective strictly related to time, the medieval peasant worked less than a worker today. Let me say that again, because you gotta picture this. A medieval peasant worked less, L-E-S-S, than a modern worker or salary man. That is true. They certainly worked harder, but compared to contemporary people, they worked much less. First of all, work was regulated by the rhythm of the seasons and the lack of artificial lighting bounded to sunrise and sunset. In the winter months, particularly in the latitudes of Central and Northern Europe, work in the fields typically ended around 4 p.m. 4 p.m. sounds like a holiday. I mean, I don't know about you, but like, usually I work until... Yeah, never mind. Before I go to bed. What do you say? Certainly there were other occupations that could be carried out within the home, for example related to the preservation and processing of agricultural products. But even these activities were not allowed on Sundays, when work was strictly forbidden. Okay, from now on I'm gonna go into the medieval schedule. Work until 4, then it's like, sunset, can't work anymore. Then it's Sunday, sorry, Sunday. Gosh, I haven't had a Sunday off in a while, so I mean, again, my job is so much easier, so I'm just joking here. My job is like 15 times easier than that of a medieval peasant, and I want to say I'm very lucky and very privileged when it comes to even modern day jobs. There are so many people that do jobs that compare to mine a lot harder, and I respect that very much. With that being said, every Sunday off sounds nice. We need to get back to that. Back to the origins, just, you know, Sundays off, my friend. Sundays off. Now, in addition to Sundays, there were a whole series of other holidays, such as Ash Wednesday, the commemoration of the massacre of the Innocents, the Rogation days of April 25th, the Ascension, Corpus Christi, etc., not to mention local holidays related to patron saints. All of these off work. Off work. Where do I apply? In the Novum Registrum of Lincoln, a late medieval ecclesiastical document, as many as 133 feast days were observed in the English diocese, which are indicating that more than a third of the year was effectively made up of rest days. In Central and Northern Europe, the Christmas holidays were linked to a period of particularly harsh weather, during which outdoor work became prohibitive, so much so that in the late Middle Ages, the first Monday after Epiphany was called Plough Monday, as it marked the return to work in the fields after the winter break. The laboratores found themselves working within a type of building which was called cortis. This is a type of productive structure inherited from the ancient Roman villa, owned by this or that nobles or a representative of one of the other two social classes. The cortis was divided into two distinct sections, the pars dominica and the pars massaricia. Yes, I'm using ecclesiastical Latin because it's closer to medieval Latin, for all of those who are now typing angry that I'm not using classical Latin. I only use classical Latin pronunciation on my ancient Roman videos. We are in the Middle Ages today. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. The pars dominica, usually consisting of a third of the cortis land, was directly under the control of the lord. Formed by the best lands, it was cultivated through corvée, a form of payment that the laboratores had to guarantee to the landowner in exchange for partial usufruct of the pars massaricia. The pars massaricia was divided into lots rented by the lord to the laborers, who, in addition to paying rent through corvée labor in the pars dominica, had to give the owner a portion of their own harvest. Now, this corvée that we just mentioned didn't just involve working in the pars dominica, but it also included all extraordinary maintenance operations within the territory. It was only in the late Middle Ages, with the emergence and proliferation of specialized workers, that specific manual labor activities gradually decreased in type and intensity. However, in the early Middle Ages, these activities were frequent and ranged from hydraulic work, so maintenance of wells, canals, embankments, etc., to tasks related to roads and bridges, and the center to which the cortis referred to, usually an abbey or a fortress. These structures were initially made of wood, then increasingly incorporated masonry elements, and peasants could take refuge inside them in case of external raids. Initially, military operations, particularly in the first part of the early Middle Ages, were carried out by the bellatores, which included not only high-ranking nobles, but also their entire retinue, consisting of modest and small landowners. As larger kingdoms and power formed, often competing with each other, laboratores found themselves conscripted into their lord's armies. Now, clearly up to this point, we understand very well the distinct functions of each of these three different types of categories within medieval society, and we understand clearly then in a situation of war or battle, the bellatores, well, they are the professionals. Not only you've got the mounted nobility, you've got the knights, but you've also got men-at-arms, so people that know how to use weapons and armor and own them. And clearly we understand that the oratores are the monks, so they are the ones that pray, they don't know how to fight. What about the workers though? Because we just said that the laboratores eventually will be deployed as units to fight for the Lord's army. Well, there is a sort of progression, if you will, in the development of how laboratores were employed in the battlefield. For instance, initially they only had civilian roles, such as, for example, the idea of maintaining and managing supplies. But eventually they are upgraded into reconnaissance roles, and then finally harassment roles with light throwing and shooting weapons. Finally, as more and more of these are deployed, the lords of the medieval feudal kingdoms decide to assign them role of conscripted militia. Now, of course, this that we spoke about now, about being a medieval person, specifically a peasant in medieval Europe, is only focusing on their place in society and really the way they worked and their life when they were called to serve their lord, for example, during a military campaign. But there is so much more that could be said about medieval peasants. We just touched very briefly upon their diet, but perhaps a dedicated video or a dedicated episode onto how they made their food. And I really mean it when I say made, because today we just go to the supermarket, just go around, walk a little bit around, get whatever we want. Maybe we even complain, oh, they ran out of this specific brand of milk and oh, that's the one I like, or this ice cream. But then again, we get whatever we want. We eat things when they're not seasonal. Everything is at our fingertips. One could even say maybe that's not the best thing. With that being said, we're very lucky, but in comparison, a medieval person made their food. So they would be more similar, if you have friends who actually live in a farm, to this type of people that I respect very much, that know how to make everything. They know how to butcher an animal. Well, I mean, I love animals, but you know, in times of need, in times of need. So you know how to butcher an animal if you need to, you go and get your eggs fresh, you know how to milk a cow, you know how to produce cheese on your own, you know how to make sausages, you know how to plant all sorts of different types of vegetables. Like, all of these skills meant that you would make your food and you knew exactly what you were eating. Whereas today, we don't even bother reading the labels behind the food that we eat, and who knows what sort of chemicals they put in there. And then legislation doesn't even make it necessary to tell us every single element, and half of those chemicals I can't even read. I think in a way there is something beautiful about the simpler times, particularly when it comes to this idea of I take a seed, I plant it, I grow it, then I see all the vegetables produced, and then I use that to make my own soup together with the fish that I went fishing, and then the sausages that I made, like all, and the bread and the flour that I produced because I cut the wheat. It does have its own poetry. And it also has, and even though it was a lot harsher, and clearly you were connected to the weather, you were connected to times of famine, it would have been a lot more difficult. But it does make me respect them more. And also a little bit in my imagination, if you allow me to do so, and kind of remove a little bit the negative things for a moment, and the things that were really difficult. I like to imagine what would my life be if I were a medieval peasant, from the moment I woke up till the moment I went to bed. But perhaps as a first episode, this could suffice, and then let me know if you like. I could make an episode dedicated to, for example, being a medieval nobleman, or being a clergyman, or then again I can go deeper into this very topic of a farmer, or a citizen, or a merchant. I would like to continue this series and make like these small bites episodes to just share what it would have been like to be a man or a woman in the medieval period, to construct it as a little puzzle that we put together and allows us to then imagine based on the sources. Alright, noble ones, but thank you very much for watching this video. If you liked it, please remember thumbs up, and if you're not yet a member of this community, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.